This is the Podcast Digest. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest, and this is episode 12, Totally Dollop. Hope you guys have had a great week of podcast listening. I know that I've been doing so. If you're brand new to the show, you just arrived through word of mouth or by some other means, finding the show on Twitter or on our website, thepodcastdigest.info. Thank you very much for joining us again this week for the 12th episode, and I want to encourage each and every one of you who may be a little newer to the show to go back and check out previous episodes, doing there what I'll be doing here, which is telling you about two great podcasts that I think should be a part of your subscription list. And if you agree or you like some of the things I'm talking about today, please go back and check out the old episodes. This is Dan Lizette, and I am back now with another great show. It's been another busy week. I've been receiving a lot of show recommendations from people. I've been checking them out as time goes by, and wow, I'll tell you what, there's so many new shows coming out. Podcasting really is starting to explode like crazy, which is awesome. I'm doing my best to keep up. If you've sent in a show recommendation via Twitter, via email, I am taking a look at those as quickly as I can. Here on the Podcast Digest, just as a quick side note, I've been doing more and more upgrades and really trying to take the show to the next level. As you guys can see, I've brought back the intro music, a new version. Not totally in love with it yet, but it's something. I really thought that listening back to my own shows, that starting out, I really wanted something that if you have it in a playlist, you say, oh, time for the Podcast Digest. So let me know what you think about it. Still a work in progress. I will try to make it better. This is my second show now with the new microphone I obtained, as well as the mixer, which is making these other pieces that I'd like to add be a lot more simpler to approach. So let me know what you think as well about sound quality. Has it improved? Has it fell off the table? Anything like that? It's important to me, and I want to know what you think as well. Also, in a couple of weeks, I'm hopeful to have my first guest. It will be an in-person guest. Actually, will be my brother, hopefully, and that should be happening the weekend of Thanksgiving. So hopefully we can have something a little bit different for you, a little break from format, and a nice conversation that I think you guys might enjoy. So it'll be my first sort of break from the standard format. But I'll talk more about what I have planned for that next week. But let's get down to brass tacks, shall we? Talk about this week's show. First, it's our discussion section. I call it Listener Pro Tip. So for this week's pro tip section, I wanted to talk about finding new podcasts. It kind of surprised I'm 12 episodes in and haven't brought up this subject matter yet. So that is sort of what the Podcast Digest is all about, right? Finding new shows. How do you go about finding new shows? Well, maybe I might tell you a little bit what I do, and maybe that will help you out, because that's what we're all about. So first and most obvious, if you will, is iTunes. iTunes is the big daddy of the podcasting world and a great place to find out about new shows. Of course, they've got their top charts, and they've got the list broke down into categories. If you're in iTunes or the podcast app from Apple, you can sort of sort and go by categories, subcategories, see top charts for each one of those. So that'd be the first suggestion I have, is to go through the top charts sections for any categories that you're interested in and just check out the list. Maybe find something that you haven't found before, read a few reviews, so on and so forth. Also, iTunes is home of the infamous new and noteworthy section. It is where all the podcasters want to be, new and noteworthy. It is great for discovery of podcasts that you've not previously heard of, and it is a huge exposure element for podcasters. But there are other tools. There are other means as well. Your podcast player, if you're an Overcast, Downcast, Pocket Cast, Beyond Pod on Android, whatever you use, they usually have some charts and trending lists or personal recommendations from who you follow on Twitter. That's a feature of Overcast. Check those out as well. As you guys know, I am a Pocket Cast user, and I have found a lot of great shows just by kind of going through the charts and lists that are available inside your own podcast player. But let's talk about some things you may not have necessarily thought of. Here's one. In your social media app of choice, be that Facebook, be that Twitter, heck, even Instagram, any of those, search hashtag podcast. It's a really interesting way, because almost all podcasts, or I probably should say a lot of podcasts, will hashtag that into their new episode announcements, into talk about, guests that they're having or what have you. It's just an easy way to pull in a broad sense of show postings, as well as people talking about shows that they've listened to online. So try to search hashtag podcasts and just scroll through the results. You will see a lot. And here's another one. Check the followers. So let's say there is a show you like. Let's say you're a big fan of this one. Let's say you're a big fan of the Podcast Digest. If you go through my follower tab right now, you will find a whole bunch of great shows. There are so many awesome shows, especially in the smaller, more independent markets that are following the Podcast Digest. But not just this show. If you're a big fan of one of the ones that I've talked about already, if you're a big fan of, S. Anthony Says, or you're a big fan of macOS Ken, or you're a big fan of Dark Angels and Pretty Freaks, go through their follower tab on Twitter or their likes on Facebook, and you will often see other shows that are using them as, one of their subscriptions. And it's a great way to kind of get related material. If you like this, then you might like that type of thing. A couple other things that you might want to do, something that I've been doing lately, and I don't know where I got this from or why I started doing it, but I've been starting to screenshot and send out my hashtag up next. So basically what's in queue, and I'm planning on listening to that day, that afternoon, that evening, and that is a really cool way to sort of figure out what people listen to. Recently I sent out an up next a couple nights ago, and Jason Snell from the Clockwise podcast I recommended, as well as the Incomparable and a ton of other shows, he had replied with his up next, a screenshot of Overcast, his podcast player of choice, with the shows that he was planning on listening to. And I thanked him for it because I thought, hey, that's really cool knowing what this guy who actually runs a lot of podcasts that I listen to and I'm a fan of is listening to Up Next. And I actually did have a couple of subscriptions come from that. So Up Next is another neat way, maybe ask your podcast listener friend or another host of a show that you like, hey, what's in your Up Next queue? And if you can ask them to put that out there, it's a neat way to figure out what they're interested in. Speaking of which goes into my last point about finding new podcasts, and that is probably the most valuable way of finding new podcasts, which is ask a friend. All right, if you have somebody that you know who is a podcast listener who, like myself, spends a lot of time with earbuds or Bluetooth headset in listening to new shows, ask them, hey, what do you listen to? What do you like? I've done that with a couple of people at the office, a couple of friends of mine who I do know are into podcast listening, and they will tell me about some shows that they like, that they're interested in, and that also sort of similar to going through somebody's follower list starts to let you know what you might want to check out. So be it iTunes, the lists on your podcast players, searching hashtag podcasts, checking the follower lists of shows, asking a friend, asking what their up next is. Those are a bunch of different ways that I've used here at the Podcast Digest to sort of get exposed to new shows. And if you do those things, I'll tell you what, you will end up with a mountain of different shows to check out. And I think that it is a great set of tools to utilize to build out your subscription list. But also, keep listening to the Podcast Digest. I like to think it's going to be one of the best ways for you guys to find some new shows. That's my goal anyways. I'm trying to give you guys some quality recommendations to add to your subscription list. So let's begin with our 2 show recommendations for this week, episode 12 of the Podcast Digest. And I'd like to begin with my first show recommendation. It's called No Totally. The hosts are Brian and Shawn. They are found on Twitter at NoTotally. The site is nototally.com. Before I get into the details, let me begin my talk on No Totally by saying that I've discovered a few things in these last few months since the launch of the Podcast Digest. One of the things that became very clear and obvious to me is that there are a lot of movie and pop culture podcasts out there. And I think that the reason why is that movies sort of tend to be like a universal language. I'm sure that you watch movies. I definitely watch movies. We all have our opinions about what we think is great, which certain ones sort of fall short, and which ones we like, why we don't like them, why we might like them, thinking our friends or family members may like something. Podcasts have always been a great way for folks to kind of get their views and opinions out there. And many of the shows I've reviewed, like The Do-Over, How Is This Movie, are very movie-centric. And others, like I've talked about That'll Play, will touch on movies, but they also cover a broader range of topics. I think that No Totally kind of stands in the middle of these type of shows. What I mean by that is that they're not necessarily a strictly movie-centric show, but they're not all the way into a lot of pop cultural reference. They're sort of right down the middle, and they do an awesome job of it. They've got about 31 episodes out right now at the time of this recording. Brian and Shawn tackle a movie each week, and they talk about the whole experience. They sort of will go into the plot details. They'll go into the entertainment value, the actors and directors involved, sort of where it fit with their career arcs. And they also add their own personal story. So did they see it in the theater when it came out, however long ago? Did they see it at home? How could you go about seeing it now? And it's a really great back and forth discussion, clocking in around 45 minutes, give or take, depending on the episode. It's really clear that they've done their research on here, and they always bring the facts and perspectives that you may not have thought of, or even better, at least in my case, they haven't gone for, very often anyways, looking through their episode list, for the really big titles. They've sort of gone for the somewhat obscure, maybe somewhat less popular shows that maybe you've heard of, but didn't get the chance to check out, and they'll really break it down for you. Now, listening to it, of course, could be considered a spoiler. They make no bones about it that obviously listening to a 45-minute chat about a movie that's been out for a little bit, you're going to kind of get the gist and idea of what the show's about. But I really think that actually it makes me think, maybe I want to go and check that out now, because I probably wouldn't have done so anyways with some of the particular movies that they've reviewed. But that's what's great about it. It kind of expands your horizons a little bit. And if you are a fan of movies, this is one that you need to add to your subscription list because of that sort of expansion of what may be something you're normally a fan of, and they take on some of those less popular shows, movies, if you will. And they got a great perspective about doing it. The back and forth that these two have is really something to hear. You've got to check it out. They don't brand it as a comedy podcast, and I wouldn't say that it's hilarious per se, but it definitely will give you a chuckle or two. And most importantly, it's highly entertaining listening to these two gentlemen, Brian and Shawn, go back and forth on their thoughts and ideas on some of these movies. And their perspectives are different enough. It's not two of the same voices talking about a particular movie. Definitely distinct personalities and points of view. Now, I've worked through about a third of their episodes. I'm still working through some of the previous back ones that I will go ahead and listen to as well. And I've really been entertained with each one, which is why I've added it here as my recommendation this week here on the Podcast Digest. I do want to highlight one episode. They did a review of the movie Adaptation. I really, really liked this movie, and they had a great discussion about it. No Totally also does a good job with adding in a lot of the sound bites from the movies, and they really give you an idea. So they'll talk about, when so-and-so said, and then they'll cut to an actual sound clip from the movie, which is really helpful. And I hadn't seen Adaptation in, 15 years or so. Now it makes me want to dig out the box of DVDs I've got, or at least to check and see if it's streaming on Netflix, because they had a really well done, great discussion on this movie. And I think I'm going to be going back and checking that out. So that is one episode I did want to highlight for you. They did make a cool format choice as well at some point when they decided how to set up No Totally, and that is that they announce which movie they're going to be talking about for the next episode. So if you want to go ahead and watch that movie at the same point, sometime over the next week, then the discussion that they end up having on the next episode ends up meaning a whole lot more to you. And of course, I think that I might try to do that. Time permitting, of course, but it is a great idea in terms of getting people to come back and say, hey, I watched this movie this week like you guys are going to. What do you think? And sort of to follow up on what I said in my listener feedback section, I believe it was last week's episode. If you do that, I strongly encourage you guys to reach out to their Twitter account @NoTotally and let them know, hey, I watched this show. This is what I thought. I'll be interested in your thoughts. Or after you hear the episode, let them know if you agree or disagree. They are very engaged in their Twitter account, and I want to give a special mention to that because not only do I see them engage very frequently with their listeners, but I also see them as really good podcast community citizens. What I mean by that is they're always helping out other shows. They're always spreading the word, leaving iTunes reviews. I did make mention last week of the show that they had left me and the Podcast Digest a review of iTunes. I want to be clear that this was totally unsolicited. I didn't ask them to do that. They just did it on their own. They didn't ask me to review them on the show here. I just simply was able to take a listen to them based on their willingness to listen to my show. And when I did, I was pleasantly pleased at what I heard on the other end. So I just want to be clear that there was no back and forth here, but I really do enjoy their product, and I really want to make sure that you guys check it out. So follow their Twitter account, and they will also be able to expose you to a bunch of other podcasts. I mentioned in the pro tip section this week about what a great tool it is for them to use Twitter to find out what other shows are following or who they're following. But No Totally will also actually do reviews of other shows and put them out there. And, I appreciate that here at the Podcast Digest. So check them out on Twitter. So that's my first show recommendation this week. No Totally, hosted by Brian and Shawn. Check them out, add them to your subscription list, and you will not be unhappy. I promise. So let's go to our second show recommendation this week. This one came to me from an old friend. I want to give a little recommendation or a little shout out, if you will, to a friend of mine. His name is Joel. I've known him for over 20 years. He's currently living in LA. He is a comedy show producer, and he turned me on to this podcast. If you're in the LA area, go ahead and check out Joel. Him and a bunch of other colleagues run a live monthly comedy show called The Super Serious Show. You can follow that on Twitter or Joel's goings on at Cleft Clips. That's CLEFTCLIPS. Joel, who's an old high school friend of mine, he found out I had a podcast a few weeks back, sent me over, have you heard this show? I took a listen, and thank you, Joel, for telling me all about this one. This show is called The Dollop. The hosts are Dave Anthony and Gareth Reynolds. They can be found on Twitter, Dave at Dave Anthony, Gareth at Reynolds Gareth. Or you can follow the show itself on Twitter at The Dollop. Website for the podcast is thedollop.libsyn.com. And The Dollop is a weekly podcast. As I mentioned, Dave and Gareth are the hosts. Each week, they take one topic from American history, and they discuss it at length. They got about 36 episodes so far, about 30 to 60 minutes on length. This is an adult comedy podcast, but with a twist. Let me try to explain exactly what The Dollop is. Joel, when he sent me this recommendation, said it's sort of like a sober, drunk history. And I think that works. One host will basically read a story from American history, often a very small, obscure piece of history, and they just riff on this back and forth, and it is freaking hilarious. This is a really refreshing format for a podcast, a comedy podcast. I've recommended a number of comedy shows on the past, and they were all great in their own unique way. You guys know I'm big fans of S. Anthony, Dark Angels and Pretty Freaks, and Dana Gould, and they all bring something really highly entertaining, but also very unique. And the format of The Dollop basically tears apart and rips up some crazy little tale from history, and it is completely unique and different than every other comedy show that I've recommended. Now, Dave and Gareth are the hosts. They are pros. Put them in IMDb and you'll know what I mean. They've done late night, they've done stand-up, they've been on sitcoms, they've been writers for all of those. And so the requisite resume exists here for real professional level product that ends up coming out. And this is a tightly edited, perfect sound quality, and the laughing is absolutely freaking contagious. They laugh at the story, they laugh at themselves. You'll end up doing the same. I think the best way I would categorize this show is what I would call audio improv. So the historical reading sort of sets the stage, and Dave and Garrett just go back and forth on this. This, like a couple of the other shows I've recommended in the past, are really hard to kind of put in a box and succinctly summarize for you exactly what you will get if you subscribe to The Dollop. But if you're listening to the Podcast Digest, I hope you're here because you like finding out about new shows, and maybe even more specifically, the shows that I like and the shows that I'm recommending. Some of it is a little bit of blind faith, I'm sure, when I ask you guys to try something new, something you may not have done or found on your own without hearing about it first. If that's the case, I need you to take my word for this. The Dollop is something you need to put in your search bar of your podcast app and take a listen. Pick any episode, but I think you'll find that this is going to be an excellent addition to your subscription list. It's gotten more, what is it that you're listening to? Reactions from my wife as we're sitting in the living room and I'm listening to The Dollop on my earphones and I can't stop busting out loud laughing. This is one of those ones that I am absolutely, completely confident in this recommendation. If you dig comedy, you dig laughing, and you dig something new and different in the podcasting space in terms of what they bring to the table, you need to check out The Dollop with Dave Anthony and Gareth Reynolds. You can follow the show, as I said, at The Dollop, and this will be one you will not regret, I promise you. So that's my second show recommendation this week. We've got The Dollop and No Totally. So we've got some movie and comedy here for you this week on the Podcast Digest. If you're enjoying what I'm doing, if you like this show, please tell a friend. I really would appreciate it. You could share the show on any of your social media. If you're a Facebook fan, the Podcast Digest is on Facebook. Of course, on Twitter, @PodDigest. We're up to almost 500 followers now, and I'd love to see that number go higher and higher so that these great shows I'm talking about each and every week can get more and more exposure. I really think, and the reason I started the Podcast Digest is I truly believe there are some great people doing some great work out there, and I want to try to be that vehicle of sharing where you can come here every week, find out about some great new shows. I've been receiving some awesome feedback from people who have said, thanks for telling me about this show or that show. I'm listening now. It's great. It's awesome. And I try to share those with the hosts of the shows that people are now tagging on to. It's really what I wanted to accomplish with the Podcast Digest. I hope that that's what you're getting out of this show. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time with me each week to listen to the Podcast Digest. My name is Dan Lizette. Thank you all again. And I will be back again next week with a brand new episode of the Podcast Digest.